Hey, thanks for joining us. We're not sure about the technology 100%. I have Kim from Terrarium Therapy, our gracious host, on speakerphone. So she'll be speaking a bit presently.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, James, real quickly, are you on live right now? Where can I see you? Where can I find you?
Should be in the comments section on the event.
So let me go in there and check in the comment section. Well, I mean, we can do this without me actually seeing you. Oh, there you are. Got it. Perfect. Okay, so we're probably going to be on a bit of a delay, but we've had a plethora of issues, and 100% of them were mine, but all technological. So we're hoping that this will suffice for this week, and then we will get better at this as we go. But I wanted to just say
That was my fault.
that we're excited for these live videos and the idea of connecting with you guys during this time. We're obviously, Terrarium Therapy is obviously a mobile plant business, so we're immobile right now and our lives have changed, so we're coming up with creative ways to keep connected with you guys, which is this being one of them. And then moving forward, we have a lot of virtual workshops planned, which include parent and child workshops and orchids workshops and Tokidama stuff with orchids. So I guess tonight we had on the agenda to speak with James, who is from Houseplant Hospital. And James, do you want to just tell us a little bit about Houseplant Hospital and how it got started and why you started it? I think it's a really creative name, and I think it's really funny as well. So go ahead and just give us a little background.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I started it as, well, for a few different reasons, and I guess I'd rather not get into all those reasons, but the name just kind of struck me as like one of those things, like, I wonder if that exists, and it turns out it didn't. So I think the only other one was some British thing, like they had it as an event. They would have people bring in their plants and stuff. And there was this other one that was like, oh, hey, Joy. Hey, Nicole. So this other one was like out in Kansas or somewhere. So I was like, cool, this thing doesn't exist. I'm going to go for it. Because I've always kind of helped people with their plants. Or I'd go into some waiting room somewhere and I'd be like picking dead leaves off a plant or whatever. So it kind of legitimizes my like kind of plant intrusions in a more professional way. And it's also, it was a reason I wanted to do it was to try to take over one of the storefronts in my town where I live in Swarthmore.
Okay.
And that was really awesome. That lasted like 2 years.
Okay.
I was able to kind of take my plant collecting stuff to the next level by helping other people with it, which is really super awesome. And it's kind of how we ended up together, I think, right?
Yeah, so we have a mutual friend, and I think the mutual friend has either been to the Houseplant Hospital or had talked about it, but I remember walking through Swarthmore probably about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, would that be accurate? And seeing their sign, and I remember taking pictures of it because I just thought it was very creative. And, you know, I think the main reason I reached out to you is because I am not a houseplant expert. I am very knowledgeable with succulents and cacti, and I'm beginning to broaden my horizon, but I thought that you would be a great connection on the Terrarium Therapy plant expert panel.
Wow.
I just made that up.
I'm flattered. I'm flattered. And people sometimes are like, oh, Houseplant Hospital, are you a houseplant doctor? And I'm like, no, I'm at best a custodian. And even sometimes I'm not even a very good custodian. And they're like, oh, well, can you tell me what this is? I'm like, yeah, that's rot.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason that, again, I wanted to bring you on board is because after our workshops, I get asked a lot of questions, and I get to see a lot of pictures of people's plants on a daily basis, and they'll pull their phone out, and sometimes I don't even know what plant that is, so I don't want to lead them down the wrong road, and I certainly don't want to make them feel as if I'm not experienced in any way. So I wanted to have somebody on board who would be able to help them. So I know that we have a few viewers tonight, and I don't know if that has anything to do with just your followers, but let's see where we can start. So I think the best question that I get when it comes to orchids during the workshops, the best question I see, or the most common question I get, I guess, would be, how often do I water my orchids? So,
Oh, right. Yeah, the
right,
watering question is a good question. I actually had people tell me that they got an orchid from their granny who would always put an ice cube on it once a week, like a piece of ice like that, and she'd put it on a spot where it wasn't touching any of the green part. It was just down in here somewhere, and it would just melt away, and it wouldn't do any damage. And that was her technique. Like, that's how she watered her orchid. I like to take mine, if you have a pot in a pot like this, take this part and dunk it in rainwater, or you can run some water through it every once in a while. I put ornaments. This one's a gnome. And then you let it drain out, and you do that maybe like once a week. And it changes depending on the stuff you're doing in your house. If you're running the heater, it's going to dry out faster. There's signs of drying out. The leaves will get a little kind of wrinkly looking, like this one's kind of dry right now. So see if you can see the texture on the leaf there. It's not as like firm, perhaps, as it could be. Like this one I just watered, and it's super shiny. See how shiny and firm and new and happy that one is? And then this one, this leaf has a little hole in it. Like, oh, what happened there? It was funny, when I got it, they have this little stick that goes down to hold the inflorescence up. And this stick was going right through this one leaf. And I was like, oh, I have to have it. And it healed up pretty well. It's still a leaf. And it's since pushed out a new leaf. And you see these two, this is an inflorescence.
yes.
And this is the original one that it came with. So you kind of like walk your way down. You got leaf, inflorescence, aerial root. Yeah.
Okay, so for, I guess.
One more thing, I'm sorry. The watering question too, if they sit in water, they rot. So this is a rotten one that's been sitting in water. And somebody's like, hey, what did I do? I'm like, yeah, you almost killed it, but they're really hard to kill, right? They're like super hard to kill. They're harder to kill than we know. So this is all the rotten stuff. It's all sphagnum moss that wasn't draining. I think there's actually maybe a gnat buzzing around there, because the gnats like that kind of condition. It's another good reason to quarantine stuff before you bring it into your house or around your plant collection. So with something like this, I'll take off the dead, dry stuff off the top. See how it kind of flakes right off, the old leaves. That's all coming off right around there.
Okay, so I recently read, and because I have not been around orchids most of my life, so I've recently read that all of the orchids should be potted in a plastic container, correct? With holes?
Now, orchids, like if you look at where they're from, where they grow, there's so many different kinds. I'm just going to get some scissors real quick. So there's lots of different kinds, right? So you try to figure out what they would grow on in nature and kind of try to replicate that in your collection. Okay. So these are like dry old dead aerial roots. Like they'll come right off, and this one's actually pretty rotten. So this one though, it's kind of funny because this is still alive. It's feeding the plant. It's bent right here to a point where you can almost twist it, like doing the chubby checker twist or whatever. And then it's still healthy. It goes up to meet up with the rest of the plant right there. Even though right there, it totally looks like, I don't know if you can see that. Right there, it looks like it's dead. So sometimes they could be deceiving, the ones that are dead and the ones that are alive. Sometimes it's really obvious, like this one.
So can you do me a favor? Can you hold the roots up as closely as you can? And can you point out to us what a healthy one looks like?
Sure.
Yeah, that's a healthy root, right?
So this is a baby root. This one is just kind of starting. See how it's got a nice little point to it? That's a good one. And then this one started and then got broken, so it doesn't have a point. It just has kind of like a dried up nub on it. So these are the ones that I would put into the substrate. And you're asking about, well, what's the best substrate? It really depends on the plant. They definitely don't need to go into plastic. Some of the most interesting arrangements of these I've seen are on boards or fastened somehow to something. Yeah. And then these aerial roots, they'll sink in, they'll try to find purchase wherever they can. So they'll sink into a rock or a piece of bark or whatever, and they're not really, they're more for structure, right? They feed the plant, but they keep it stuck to whatever it's growing on.
So let's back up for a second, because two reasons. There is a bit of a delay on the video, so it's kind of hard to see what we're talking about specifically at that point. But as we said, we're going to get through all of these technological glitches of this first one and come back bigger and better next time. But can we talk basics for a second? And can you explain to everybody what exactly, what family the orchids are from, why they're considered in that family, and how they grow? So I don't think most people understand, how things like air plants grow and such like that. So I know a lot of people think that orchids would be placed in regular soil, perhaps. So maybe just start with a little basic background.
Sure. So these are mostly epiphytic plants. That's epiphytes. There are ground orchids in the world, but the ones we typically have access to are these epiphytic ones. So we're going to say epiphyte.
Yeah, so when I was in Costa Rica, I saw ones that were growing on trees, and then ones that were also growing in the ground. Mm-hmm. So I think that I was a little shocked to see the ones growing from the ground. How many different species of them are there, or how many different?
Well, there's like thousands, right?
Okay.
And there's different kinds, like this one, the real common one they call moth orchid is a Phalaenopsis. Okay. And that, I think there's, out of Phalaenopsis, there's like 175 different kinds. So you get the idea. Like, this is something that, there's so many different varieties, there's so much variety, and there are different parts of the world you could find. They're specific to different parts of the world, or they're hybrids. Like the moth orchid, Phalaenopsis, I think it's got a woman's name, Dahlia, Donna. It was this particular hybrid that was really easy to clone and make lots of them. So you see these all over the place.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're affordable. So you can kind of mess them up and take your chances with them and not really have to worry about going broke while doing it. You can learn a lot of stuff just by practicing, just by messing around. So I took off like all the rot that I could, and I wrapped that one kind of funky long aerial root around. And then this would be like pretty neat to try packed into some kind of fresh substrate.
Okay.
Packed all the way up over, covering up all these old roots, just like that.
So for those of us who may not know on here tonight, can you tell them what a substrate is?
Oh, okay.
And what? Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so that looks healthy. It looks great.
Sort of.
Well, it looks better.
We're getting there. But yeah, but look at all this rotten stuff that was in there. Oh, right? Gross.
Yeah.
And that's just
was
neglect.
probably due to
Just neglect, bad habits. Somebody thinks, oh, I'm just going to water it every Tuesday at 3 o'clock. I'm going to give it 6 ounces of water every Tuesday at 3 o'clock. And it's like, yeah, well, if it doesn't need that at that time, it's gonna cause damage. It's gonna do damage. So.
Okay. So kind of knowing, I know with succulents, you can obviously read a lot through their leaves. So if they're droopy, how do you read the orchids, through their leaves or through their blooms? Like, what's the best way to know that that guy needs some water, maybe not this week?
Yeah, it's the leaves. It's the leaves. They'll start getting that kind of like wrinkly, not so happy kind of look to them. They'll be less firm. They'll be a little droopier. Like this one's a little droopier because I let it dry out a bunch. Kind of too because it's flowering. Like once something starts flowering, I try not to really mess with it at all if I can avoid it, because these blooms will last over a month. They take a really long time. Usually you get them and they're already open, and they may have been open for several weeks already. When you go to get an orchid, if you find ones that have a lot of buds that are still closed like this, as they acclimate to your room, they'll start to open up, and that's a really fun part of it too, having the orchids.
Yeah, that's really pretty.
Yeah. So the inflorescence, that's an important part to know about as well. The aerial root can kind of like look like an inflorescence. See, this is an old.
Tell us for those of you who don't know.
Yeah.
What is influenza is?
Not influenza, inflorescence.
I did not say influenza.
You just want to go viral. I know your little game. So the inflorescence is where the flowers come from. They call it a flower stalk, is another way to call it.
Okay.
And that's where the magic happens. It's sometimes, though, it's confusing because these little baby aerial roots, they kind of look like they might be starting an inflorescence, and they're not. They're just like this silvery aerial root thingy that you see. It goes all through whatever substrate. You're asking about substrate too. I kind of got off track. The substrate this one is in is mostly like they call it orchid bark. It's actually a fir bark, so it's a type of wood that doesn't tend to rot as quickly.
Okay.
And if you keep it dry, you can keep them healthy. Taking these little aerial roots as they start to come up and guiding them around to where you want them is another kind of fun, challenging thing. They're super brittle, and they'll snap, and it'll freak you out. But don't worry too much though, because like I showed you before, those other ones that were all broken and stuff, they're still working. They're still doing what they're supposed to do. So it's okay to be a little rough with your orchids.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I think people are so afraid of orchids.
I know, why?
I don't know. I want to say we. I think I am too. I think we just are. So let's see, James, if anyone else has some questions for us.
Yeah.
Okay, so Adrian Owens asked, did you say the orchids is in the air plant family?
Not exactly, no. They're similar in the fact that they live on other things a lot of times. They're attached to another plant or a rock or some other kind of thing. They're not growing up like something that would just sprout up from a seed, whatever. They can push off little daughter plants the same way as air plants. Air plants are in the bromeliad family, so they're kind of like pineapples type of bromeliad too. That's more like one that's rooted in the ground.
Okay.
That's a good question though. No, since they don't necessarily need the same kind of like a potting mix or something like that, you can get pretty creative. Like this one I did with grow stone, and the little aerial roots are climbing all over that. And I have a little bit of like orchid food I'll put in there once in a while. That keeps them happy. They need to eat something too. This one kind of got away from me. But ideally, this one would have gotten tucked into, see here it's snapping. It's bad, right? It's scary. And then I'll put some more substrate on top of that. Look, here's another one that got away.
Interesting. So we just got a question. Do they like humidity?
Yes, they love humidity. How do you get humidity in your house though, right?
Right.
So you could do it a couple ways. You could run an honest to goodness humidifier and keep a room kind of closed, like, hey, this is going to be my plant room. I'm going to have 70–80% humidity in here once in a while. It's got to like dry out though, otherwise you get mold. So it can't be just like under a glass jar and humid all the time or it'll rot. So that's one of the most complicated things to having tropical plants, is to be able to boost humidity when you need to, or to give it some humidity, like some humid conditions. The healthier ones you'll see are the ones that have adequate humidity.
Someone's asking what level of sunlight.
Actually pretty low. This one pushed this new leaf out on my desk in an office under fluorescent lights. Yeah, I mean, their light requirements are pretty mild. Actually, I have one that got a really bad sunburn last summer, and it's not a Phalaenopsis, it's a different type of orchid. See how the leaves are kind of longer.
Okay, what does it mean when they get sunburn? Can you explain
So,
that?
yeah, they get damage. They take on this damaged kind of like burnt look to them just from the sun being too intense. I think that might be what happened with this leaf on this one too. And what it'll do is it'll blister up, and you see there's a little kind of like remnants of that too. It'll blister up, and it'll go kind of like away from wherever that damage is hitting them from.
Yeah, it gives like an orangish color burn look to them.
I'm pretty sure this one is a Cattleya. So yeah, there's a lot of different orchids. Some of them are easier to find. See, this one has like really fine aerial roots, and it's actually climbing up the other one right there, if you can see that. So I'm keeping them together. I don't know. Again, when they start getting buds on them, I just try to leave well enough alone until I get to enjoy those flowers, because that's what we're in it for, right?
Yeah.
They are awesome foliage plants, though. A lot of times people think they're done once they bloom. Actually, each time they bloom, I feel like the blooms get a little bit prettier and fuller, and of course they last longer because you get them from start to finish. Now, some people think the light makes them bloom or not bloom. It's actually the temperature.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. So Jackie has a good question. We'll come back to that in a second. But I listened to a podcast recently, and the girl had talked about how to kind of provoke, maybe that's not the right word, but
like induce or, yeah, I know what you mean.
Bloom.
How to bring about the bloom, yeah.
Yeah, so she said it was all about temperature change. So she suggested bringing them into, a room with a lower temp for several weeks, and then bringing them back into the normal household temperature would kind of help out bringing the blooms with that. Is that something that you do?
That's absolutely how it works. There's a different routine for every species. They all have their within a couple degrees, and it's funny too how people who just kind of like I casually have this collection or whatever, are surprised to see these patterns in their plant collection are a reflection of their normal kind of stuff. Like, I keep it on the windowsill, I bring it out in the summer, I bring it back in, and all this stuff I happen to be doing happens to be what that plant needs to be awesome and to do its blooming or to do its go through its cycles. If it's pushing out new foliage, if it's a foliage plant, plant collections can actually be a lot more exciting than you'd expect. Well, not you, because you'd expect it, but as one might think.
Yeah, I'm expecting. For example, say I am somebody who's going to be inspired by this and has never owned an orchid, but is going to give it a shot. And they're not local to here where we are, and they don't have, say, a produce junction nearby, so they go to the Home Depot.
Sure.
And they're going to buy the Home Depot orchid.
Mm-hmm.
Has that fared well for you? Like, do you see anything wrong with that? Because sometimes, plants are just grown at bad places, like bad produce, and they have a tough start from the beginning. And then maybe the owner of this plant never had a fair shot, but they're not the houseplant expert. So what would you suggest if you're a beginner and you pick a plant up like that? What are some indications from the beginning that maybe you should be doing things a little differently? So somebody asked, how often are you going to water that? To start, what would you recommend looking out for and starting to, like, if you start to see any changes from a very beginner's perspective?
Yeah, definitely. The texture and the color on the leaves, if they get droopy or wilty, they should be firm and pretty shiny, like perky little shiny leaves.
Okay, so some of the healthy orchids that I've seen and been around are like leaves are actually very hardy and very thick and, like you said, shiny. And then I actually had an orchid that when I touched the leaf completely detached.
Yes, and that happens too. The older ones, the older leaves, they are spent and they fall away, and that's just part of their process. There's one here on this one is probably not quite ready to fall off, but you see how it's spent. It's all, the texture of it is all coarse, wrinkly, whatever. And then this was the one that had basically replaced this one. And ideally our next inflorescence is going to be coming out probably from over here somewhere where these two leaves come together. They'll either push them out, depending on the species, through this part or through where the leaves meet, the junction. And it looks like a little tiny, like mitten type of thing when it first comes out. That's how you know it's not a. That's how you know it's not an aerial root. and the mitten kind of follows the thing all the way through to the end. Let's see if you can, I don't know. It's so hard to describe, but it's kind of like a little mitten coming out from in between the leaves, like, hey, I'm going to be your next inflorescence.
Okay. So when a leaf falls out like it did with mine, that doesn't necessarily mean, my friend.
Yeah. This friend of yours.
Yeah, this friend of mine, it doesn't mean that she killed it, right? I just want to let her know.
No way, no way. The bottommost leaves, they go away. They get replaced by new foliage as you go.
So secondly, this Home Depot plant is at their home, and they start to see, what else would they notice? So the leaves are a good indication. You can kind of tell by the leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Should they be repotting it or doing anything to it?
Yeah, usually when I get a new plant, the first thing I do is go through it. I clear out whatever rotten stuff might be in there. I pack it with fresh substrate, whether it's stone or bark or expanded clay is another one. I have a clay thing over here. It's anything they can grab onto. Like this one, I think it's the Cattleya. I'll show you how it grabbed onto these clays and rocks. It's really neat. So these are all spent aerial roots. But look, they're holding right onto that clay like it's, I don't know, that's what they do, right?
Yeah, so the roots will grab on, and people ask me, another question that people have asked me is, my roots are, out of control, and they're growing out of my pot, and they're taking over my table. What should I do?
Get a bigger table. No, you can bend them. I mean, ideally, you're not going to be snapping them and breaking them like I was. You're going to be just like, as they get a little bit longer, you move them a little bit. A little bit longer, you move them a little bit, so that they're going back into the substrate. If they get out of control, you can cut them back or cut them down to a point where they're easy to push back into the substrate. I don't really like having my aerial roots splayed about like all over the neighborhood. I like to have them in the substrate where they can do their work.
Okay, so you're a little more neater with your roots, but that's just an aesthetic thing, right? So if they light them out on their table, it's not harming anyone or anything. They shouldn't have to worry about them grabbing onto the clay or other substrate, or they're okay kind of out there, just hanging out.
Yeah, there's no real harm in that. I don't feel like it's doing as much good as it could be doing in the substrate with the rest of the plant. If you have those wild ones and you even just put something next to the container where they flatten out, I guess the point is you want that plant working on making flowers. So if it's spending all this energy trying to push out aerial roots to find more places to hang on to when it really doesn't need to, the aerial roots, the plants do best, the orchids do best when those roots are all packed in as tightly as they can be to one another. They love being root bound, the orchids.
Yeah, okay. Jackie has a question. She said, I have seen orchids where it's suggesting, and I know we went over this, but I don't think she was on. She's suggesting using the ice cube method when watering. Your thoughts, please.
I'm not a huge fan of the ice cube because they would never have an ice cube in nature. And because people aren't taking rainwater and freezing it generally to make rainwater ice cubes, which would be the best thing if you're doing the ice cube thing, if you must. I'm not saying nobody does it. There's people who have a lot of success with that method. Just make sure you put your ice cube away from the plant the best you can. You don't really want that cold ice touching the foliage or the aerial roots if you can avoid it. However, like we were saying about aerial roots, they're kind of like expendable or whatever. They'll replace the aerial roots a lot faster than they'll replace foliage.
So I think that answers it for Jackie. Karen Moore asked, she said she thought she killed one as well, but all the leaves falling off.
Yeah, they'll, I mean, if all the leaves fall off and there isn't any life left in there, there's no really reviving an orchid that's done that. It's,
Have you ever revived one without leaves?
no, I mean, this one in the coffee cup here was pretty much like the first one we were messing with. Maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It ended up being very happy in the little coffee cup with the grow stone. And it made another little inflorescence. So I think it's had 3 so far, which is really cool. Yeah, so yeah, they're salvageable. I think a lot of times people get their first orchid out of the trash, or some coworkers like, hey, the flower's gone on this, I'm gonna throw it away, like just bare, like almost to the trash, diverted from the landfill. Or it's something where it's just like, oh yeah, somebody got me this as a gift or whatever, and they put it kind of off to the side and barely do anything with it, and then it surprises them with a new flower, and then they're hooked because it is strangely addictive.
Yeah. Someone asked earlier, are there certain seasons when they bloom, or is it something that it's like, I know with succulents, if they're receiving adequate sunlight, pretty much all succulents will bloom. Right. And 2 times a year, probably minimum. Is the same thing with orchids? Like, I know a lot of people tend to think that if they're super healthy, they're going to be blooming, what, like two times a year? Am I speaking out?
I'd say more like once, because they have a dormancy period, so they do a whole bunch of growing and they do a whole bunch of just hanging out. And during the hanging out time, like they're eating, they're just kind of preparing for their next growing event that may or may not include an inflorescence. So some people have orchids where they go a few years without seeing a flower on it, or they'll go years and years and years without seeing a flower on it. And it's because they're never triggered out of that like real dormant cycle and may get a new leaf here or there. They're not being fed, or the temperature is like too constant.
So kind of in an ideal situation, they should be blooming, but because they're not, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to die or unhealthy, but you should be kind of working with the temperature changing and trying to get it out of the dormancy.
Yeah, and doing like kind of like doing your due diligence, doing your research study part of it, where you're understanding what their conditions are like, where they're from. Maybe it's a place that has a rainy season and a dry season.
Right.
These sorts of things.
Areas of where they would have come from and what their natural habitat is like. Yeah. I mean, I think we're the ones that we're buying at stores like the Home Depot or Lowe's are pretty much the same plant. But perhaps not. I mean, if somebody was giving you one that was on their desk and they literally have no idea, you know, they could call someone like you. You would be able to identify it.
Yeah, if it doesn't have flowers on it, that's kind of a fun one because it's a surprise. Okay. Sometimes you'll see 50-cent orchid that had lost its blooms, and whoever's selling it knows that nobody's going to buy one without flowers on it, except maybe me or you. Right. And then for us, it's a nice surprise if we're able to clean it up, get it established and whatever, and then have it bloom and then surprise us with what color the flowers are. And the flowers can change a little bit too, like especially these particular Phalaenopsis. You can get them as white and sometimes they'll like spray paint them blue or do some artificial thing to them, and you see what their true flowers look like in subsequent blooms.
Right. And question about that.
Hmm.
I wouldn't assume that is ideal for the plant. Does that do a lot of damage when they spray paint them or not?
I mean, inflorescence is kind of like, it's a kind of like a fancy hat or whatever. You're attracting a mate, you're doing your sexy stuff in the flowers. The real, like the heart of the plant is like where these two roots, I mean, where these two leaves are in the center, like the apex, there's a baby leaf starting in there, and these fresh aerial roots. You have a couple of those and a couple leaves, and you got a shot.
I see. Okay.
And sometimes they could be so far gone that it's just an exercise in futility. And even then, if you end up learning something or it turns out to be like a rebound that you didn't expect, I'd say it's worth taking the chance.
That's cool. Did not know that.
And just being okay with stuff not working too, because that's kind of how it goes, right?
Michelle was saying, do you suggest cutting off any dead flowers and roots or letting them fall off naturally? So we kind of covered the roots, which we can revisit for a second, but
no, I like that question. That's a great question, because the inflorescence, when it dies, turns brown, and it's still useful to like carry around the plant or to arrange it in whatever substrate it's going into. The inflorescence sometimes will surprise you, because if you don't cut it and it stays green, well, this one's kind of like a dark brown, but it's not, it's alive. So if you have to cut it back, you could cut it above the second notch or the third one, because it can still push out another inflorescence from the old one. That's something that can happen. And if you cut it all the way down at the bottom, then the chances of that happening are reduced. So I'd say leave a few segments. Mm-hmm. Or if it's not turning brown, like this one had, when I got it, it had a few hanging on this, and this inflorescence didn't even exist. So I was pretty lucky that it pushed this whole thing out of this old inflorescence. I kind of got a double whammy or whatever. I call that a double whammy.
Double.
Yeah, you come up with little words for stuff.
Yeah, I like
Yeah, if it's not dead though, don't cut it all the way off, because you might still have a whammy in there for you. In this case, a double.
He asks, during dormant periods, how are they cared for?
Well, just don't let them completely dry out, and don't let them get sunburned, and give them a little food.
Is there a food for the orchids that you recommend?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's like some liquid foods that are pretty good. You want something that's pretty well balanced, because you want to grow roots, you want to grow foliage, and you want to grow flowers. So good, well balanced, mild. You don't want anything too heavy. It's just picture like in the wild, they might occasionally have some dead thing decay a little bit next to them. They may have a bird poop on them. They get the phosphate that way. So in our homes, like it's not really that different. They're getting neglected, and they're better off like that.
I think that people tend to definitely overwater orchids, which is probably what's just rotting the roots. I mean, would you say that's the quickest way to end one's life of an orchid? I don't like the K word.
Kill it. I think it's okay. It's okay to to learn that way. It was, I think, Mike McGrath from You Bet Your Garden one time said about some certain type of plant. He had to kill a couple hundred of them before he finally got the one that he did he didn't kill, because he learned all that stuff with the other 99 or whatever. And that much is true. I'd say to bring something back from almost being killed is a lot harder to do if it's rotten and mushy than if it's just too dry. It's kind of like you can add to it, you can't take so much out of it though.
Exactly. Same with
it's like putting on clothes and sweaters and stuff.
Yeah, similar concept. So we could go on and on and on, and I mean,
are there any other questions?
But I have a question for you.
Yeah.
That we're going to try to do this on a weekly basis. And I think that I would like to ask people here tonight if they have any like specifics, because I know we went over some basics, but if they have any specifics, can they reach out to you?
Sure.
And kind of give us an idea of what that would entail, if they had maybe a consultation with you, or they truly just want to give you their plant for a little bit. Do you keep them for like a specific time to get them back to better health? And then do you give them back? How does that all work? I'm sure there are various options that you offer.
Yeah, well, like the visit in the home is the best, because we can go over what you're trying to accomplish, like what your goals are and where your collection is at the moment. Somebody wants to drop something off to me, that's typically fine, especially now we're moving into the warmer months. So I have more use in my yard and all since I closed the shop down, and I don't have that space. So ideally, we're working on your stuff at your place or your office or whatever. I had somebody call me up from like Columbus, Ohio, of all places, saying that she wanted help with something, and we ended up, I think I sent her a photo, she sent me a photo. It wasn't really that like effective, I don't think. Not as much as being able to meet up in person, of course. And I know with all the changes lately with meeting up in person, we are trying to improve being able to do what we can on computers, and this sort of thing was super fun for me. So I really appreciate you coming up with the idea and hosting and all.
I would like so are you currently offer, or had you offered like a video consulting?
Not like formally, I guess. My rate's $18 an hour. So if that ends up being an hour on a video conference, or an hour in your office or your house, if it involves a lot of traveling, I'll ask for a little bit more, or materials, of course. We have to cover materials costs.
Yeah, so that's extremely affordable.
Yeah, I think it's important that that people don't refrain from collecting plants because they feel like it's expensive, because it's really not expensive.
No, I think that's really awesome. I like that because, you know, if you're a new plant parent and you're not necessarily sure you want to make the investment to start, you know, having plants, and then of course you need advice. And there is a lot of information on the internet. You can find plants that probably look similar to yours, but I think to have somebody to talk to about it is really important.
Oh yeah. Well, I have a license for a PA, Department of Agriculture, for a plant broker, which is kind of a funny thing in and of itself that exists. And so what that means is, like, somebody says, hey, I want such and such a plant, can you find it for me? I like doing little projects like that too.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so if somebody's looking for a plant maybe that is rare, or just something that they can't find, you offer that as well.
Yeah, I've done that a few times. Where I get like the orphan plants, I try to do like the plant adoptions, you know, like if somebody's looking for, I don't know, like a longleaf fig is one that comes to mind because I have one right back here. It's one of these legacy type of things where somebody had it in their house for a really super long time. I don't know if you can see it all the way back there. Just a few leaves. I don't know, but you get the idea. Like this.
Yeah, I don't know what if it's something on my end roughly is. I just have a little bit of a delay with the video to the audio.
Yeah, it's because the Facebook lags it. It's almost like broadcast TV.
Yeah, and then plus we're on the phone, so it's just a whole new level.
Yeah. But for people watching, I think they are seeing a fluid thing that's happening in what appears to be real time. And that confused me too, because I tried watching it on my laptop. But as long as the audio is good, I think that's worth something. Oh, look, the oxalis closed for the night while we were sitting here.
Again, I can't.
I know.
I'm not seeing it, but show everybody else.
Yeah, everybody's seeing it. It's just you're not going to see it for another 30 seconds.
Okay, it's okay. So,
What do you want the next one to be, Kim? Do you want to do one next week?
yeah, let's do another one next week. So Nicole is telling me that there are no delays.
Yeah, it's all good.
Well, do you guys have Michelle? Michelle is asking how often do you change the orchid moss after making one in a terrarium therapy class? Well, Michelle, we're going to actually be offering a orchid cookie dominant class again April 2nd.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be at that one, right?
Yeah, we're going to be doing that one together. So it's going to be mostly Jane's leading that class, but I'll be there as well. And that's the 2nd of April. I believe it's 7:30. And Michelle, if you wanted to join that workshop at no cost, since you already came to one of our other ones, we'll put you in on that live stream. And if you need any supplies, maybe if your orchid's not doing well or something like that, just reach out to Terrarium Therapy.
Yeah, or send me a photo. I'll look at it.
Yeah, because I mean, there's no reason why she couldn't be involved in that class again too.
You get live sphagnum moss for your workshop? I meant to ask that.
Yes. Yes.
Nice. Because a lot of that dried up stuff just turns brown and.
Yeah, I don't think that you can even use that with the orchids, right?
People use it. I've seen it used as substrate a lot. There's actually some dead, messed up stuff in this one in particular. But I just love that sphagnum moss when it's live. It's so cool.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, Michelle, no worries. Reach out to me or just send us a message on Facebook and we'll get you into that class.
Oh, the other thing with that moss, if you kill your sphagnum moss and you wrap a fresh layer around it, that's basically what sphagnum moss does, like in nature. It's just layers and layers of living. It's living on top of layers and layers and layers of decomposing sphagnum moss.
Okay,
Pretty neat stuff.
Yeah, that wouldn't be a problem for the orchids whatsoever, right?
No, I mean, you could soak a dead, dried up ball of sphagnum moss with a living orchid in the middle, and the orchid will just do its thing. It'll push out roots, and I'm kind of interested now to see what Nicole, it was Nicole that was asking about that?
Oh, no, this was Michelle.
Michelle.
She did one of the classes that I hosted with it, and we used sphagnum moss, but I don't know what happened. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. I like that too. It's kind of like there's some accountability there. It's not like we go away after we work with somebody.
No. We're here to stay.
I mean, I'm here as long as you'll have me, right?
Well,
We're almost to the hour, so we're good. On time and under budget.
So we will be doing this next week I just wanted to say something real quickly. Obviously, we're doing an orchid class with James April 2nd. We're going to be offering it. It's on the Facebook page right now. We're going to be building a orchid cookie dharma together. He's going to show us how to properly do that. And if you attended one of our other classes where I have just been learning and you want to redo the class with us, I have no issue shipping you whatever you may need for that. If you're just hopping on to ask questions about the one that maybe you previously done and you don't need anything, then that's all well and good. But if you would like us to ship you something, if you're interested in the class and you haven't participated in one before, we're doing the virtual stuff now. And you will sign up just as you normally would for a workshop, and then you'll get the kit in the door to your doorstep about 2 to 3 days out of the workshop. So James, for a question for people who are interested in the workshop and say they're in New Jersey and I'm shipping them out, what should they do with the orchid if it arrives after they take it out of the box and they're waiting maybe 2 days before our workshop?
Is it, it's bare roots?
Yeah, it's either going to be in Orchid Park or Bare Root.
That's fine.
Would be okay, just kind of.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it would probably be fine for an indefinite amount of time, as long as it has a little bit of drainage after the first several days. But yeah, no, nothing bad will happen if it's a few days.
What I thought. Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, no. The other funny thing I get, people ask me sometimes, they're like, I want a plant for my bathroom that gets no light. I'm like, well, here's what you do. You grow something in a regular place and you let it sit in your bathroom for a couple days, and then you put it back to where it belongs.
That's what I suggest doing.
Yeah, move them around. That's all that's happening. What you're describing, it goes from the greenhouse. Hopefully it doesn't freeze or get too cold, and I'm sure you have safeguards against that.
Yes.
And then it gets to where it needs to be, and we have some fun.
Yeah, you just move things around. If you want, plants in your bathroom and you don't have any light, we'll take it to the light for a little bit, take it in there, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
We will be doing a lot of virtual workshops, guys, and we will be working with James as well and doing a lot of these Facebook Lives in the future. If you guys have any suggestions, or maybe next class we'll do, James, if you're okay with this, a BYOP, bring your own plant, and maybe we can talk about some of the ones that people have in front of them, and maybe if they have any questions.
So I'm thinking if there's a way to post in the comments, like to post a photo, that might be good. Otherwise, we might have to do Zoom because Facebook Live is so limited.
I know. I mean, we'll have to talk. We'll have to figure this out. We're figuring it out, everyone.
Look, I'm laughing so hard I'm shaking the table.
Very interesting leading up to getting on here, but I'm glad that we did it. I'm hearing back that the audio was good.
Yeah, I think it worked out.
I'm not upset that I'm not on there visually.
Yeah. I'm going to pour a whiskey and watch the replay and hopefully not cringe too hard, because I know I'm pretty bad at the video stuff. I'm improving, but I start out really bad. Is usually how it goes.
I mean, it says it reached 116 people, and we had some engagement, and that's what we're trying to do right now. Because guys, this is, as we said, a very unusual time, and I thought that taking what I thought would be 30 minutes now, coming on an hour.
Oh, really? I planned for an hour. That's funny. We barely talked at all about this before we did it.
Hopefully that isn't obvious. But you guys, let us know, and all of the virtuals are going to be through Zoom, so it's going to be a lot clearer, a lot easier to see things, and you guys, thank you so much, and James, thank you.
You're welcome.
People should go check out your website, and then on there, Houseplant Hospital LLC, they should reach out to you with any questions. And I think your rates are amazing.
Oh, thank you.
affordable for people who love plants and maybe are a little intimidated by it, or
Yeah, well, that's part of the fun. That's actually getting back to your first question, why I did it, is just because I think everybody can really benefit from having like some plants around. And there's nothing to be scared of. It's like, so you mess up, so what?
oh, what do you got there?
This is South African boxwood bonsai and a planter from my friend Lynn Berman. She does ceramics in Old City. So I wanted
That's
to give her a
gorgeous.
shout out
Very
at
cool.
the last minute. It's hard to see because it's, I don't know, but it's a really neat. The tree was actually from your buddy from your buddy and mine, Bucks County Bonsai.
Yeah. So that's another thing, guys, that we're going to be doing once we get Scott. He's going to be doing some virtual workshops too, because we had a lot of bonsai stuff planned for you guys, and we're trying to bring it online as well. So, James, I think the next time, if you agree to it, will be next Tuesday at this time.
I guess so.
Are you in?
Yes. I don't see any reason why not. It's just super fun.
Okay. So we'll do next Tuesday at 7:30. And then if you're interested, everything's up about the Orchid Kokedama class that we'll be hosting together April 2nd. It's on the page. Go there, buy a ticket.
That's right. Spend that money.
Spend the money, and you'll get a nice little kit in the mail, and then get to spend time with us, and we'll answer any questions and guide you along the way. And
if you get cold feet and you don't want to spend time with us, you'll have the orchids and stuff. You could do it yourself.
If there's a technological issue on your end, we won't take any offense to it. Real quickly about the Kokedama stuff. We had talked today about it, and like, I have had no issue with the jades. I have had some issues with the orchids.
Yeah. It's super tricky. I mean, as a technique, as a method, it's tricky, and it's a little bit intimidating because it's like there's a lot that goes into it. Maybe I don't know exactly. You know what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah, it's probably kind of easy if you don't work with the roots the right way, you're going to suffocate the roots, right?
Well, yeah, it's both. It's funny because it's both. They have to be packed in tightly, and they have to be able to breathe. They have watering requirements, and they have like airing requirements.
Okay.
Yeah.
They are very beautiful, and I think that we will most definitely help everybody online get the finished product right. So
yeah, and if not, it's not like it's not the end of the world, especially if you learn something. If you learn something and you go out, you keep those materials, the orchid dies, but your moss doesn't die. Maybe that happens. It's go to wherever, find $1 orchid and do it again. And maybe that one is the one that is the winner for you.
I think that's the most important takeaway from tonight is that houseplants, like cooking, like other things, require maybe
a tolerance for failure.
less talent, more experience.
Yeah.
Lots of money along the way. No,
Yeah,
patience. But that's not necessarily true. You can pick up plants affordably in a lot of places right now, and it's all trial and error, right?
Totally.
Did you make up a plant expert? Were you born a plant expert?
No way. I mess up all the time. I'm not even an expert now, I wouldn't say. I'm professional because I have a business doing it, and I try to be professional most of the time. I mean, but that's part of the fun too, because it's like there's professional, like expert, whatever is a very, what does Milena call it? Rigid, I guess, or whatever. And then there's a more of a relaxed approach, and I think that's really what we're going for as a hobbyist. if it's stressing you out and it's not fun, then
No.
you probably aren't going to be doing it very long.
No, it's not stressed out. Plants should definitely not. They do, however, stress a lot of people out. And, you know, it's not fun to kill something, and it's not fun to have it around. But I think what we learn the most about this is it's trial, and it's not intimidating if you don't allow it to be. And if you think you're killing a plant, call you.
That's a great takeaway.
Okay?
That's a great takeaway. I guess we'll continue this next week.
Yes, next week. And thank you, everyone. And James, I'll be in touch with you later.
Okay, thanks, Kim.
Thank you.
So long.
Bye-bye.
Oh, thanks everybody for coming out, checking out the workshop thing, and I'll see you all hopefully next week. Have a good one. Bye-bye.